Shabbat Shalom. I made 2 halakhic decisions for the community this week in consultation with the ritual committee, so I'd like to share them with you, and of course we can discuss them during Kiddush. The first is that non-Jews will now be able to open and close the Ark. And the second, which I'm sure will be the more controversial, is to discuss how we make coffee on the Sabbath. And I hope you know that you can share any concerns that you have with me and with the ritual committee, and I request that you listen with an open heart. So I'll tell you a story. In 2009, my rabbinical school classmates and I were preparing to apply for our first jobs. And my friend Rachel was very excited. She had found a synagogue in Atlanta, and her set of skills matched exactly what they said they needed. And when she read about the vision of the community, it matched what excited her about Jewish leadership. There was just one tiny problem. They said no women need apply. 2009. So in our community, it seems very obvious to many of us, or very comfortable for many of us, that women should be in roles of leadership. But it wasn't for this community, because change happens gradually and change is uncomfortable. Look, in the 1950s, the big conversation in the conservative movement was, can you drive to the shul? Because America, after the GIs came home, people were moving into the suburbs, and there were no longer urban centers around which everyone lived. And the conservative community had to decide, do we close our doors or do we let people drive on the Sabbath? In the 1980s, the conversation was, can women have roles of leadership? And in 2016, the conversation is, we have many non-Jewish members of our community. So how do we include them? The essence of the conservative movement from its birth has always been the balance between tradition and change. I'd like to read you a quote from Zacharias Frankel. He lived in 19th century Germany, and he's one of the founding figures of conservative thought. Because it's a translation of 19th century German, I'll read the quote twice. It's pretty rich. So here's what he wrote for the periodical. The purpose of the Zeitschrift is the reconciliation of belief and life, the assurance of progress within our faith, and the refining and regenerating of Judaism from and through itself. This is the circle in which our effort must move. Anything outside this circle ceases to be Judaism. Those to whom even this circle seems to be extensive incline to stagnation and oppose the demands of life and its activity. I'll read it one more time with my interpretation. The purpose of the Zeitschrift, that's the name of his periodical, is the reconciliation of belief and life, the assurance of progress within our faith, and the refining and regenerating of Judaism from and through itself. In other words, how do we both progress and stay within the boundaries of Judaism? This is the circle in which our effort must move. Anything outside this circle ceases to be Judaism. But those to whom even this circle seems to be extensive incline to stagnation and oppose the demands of life and its activity. In other words, if we progress too quickly, we're no longer Jewish, but if we progress too slowly, we will atrophy. Conservative Judaism is in this constant state of change, but the change must be grounded in halakhic precedent. So what I'll do is walk you through the tshuva that was made in 2013. It was written by Rabbi David Booth. He's a rabbi in Palo Alto. And he approached it in 3 different ways. He addressed the actual halakha, he addressed the symbolism, and he addressed the sociological reality. So for the halakha, he says, and by the way, one might agree with his halakhic reasoning and still be emotionally uncomfortable with his conclusion. And that's okay, those feelings are valid. But I also think it's important to ask oneself, if you are uncomfortable, Where do those feelings come from, and why? Here's how he addressed the halacha. He said, well, there's very little in the literature about opening or closing the ark at all, because it's not a chiyuv. A chiyuv has a very specific definition. It's a ritual act that one member of the community can take to release others from that same obligation. An example would be making kiddush. I can make that prayer, or really any of us who are adult Jews can make that prayer on behalf of the community. We don't all have to make an individual prayer. So a chiyuv is one of those ritual acts that is commanded, and one person can take it on for the entire community, but there is a caveat, which is it can only be fulfilled by someone who is obligated to do that act. In the conservative movement, that means anybody who is beyond the age of bar bat mitzvah. The opening and closing of the ark is not a chiyuv. So there's very little literature on it in our halachic sources. The one place that he found, the Shulchan Aruch addressed, which is a medieval law code that is very well respected, it addressed, can a child open and close the ark? And the Shulchan Aruch concluded, yes, it's not a chiyuv. A child can fulfill this obligation for the community because it's not really an obligation. So what Rabbi Booth did in 2013 is he extrapolated, well, if a child can open and close the ark, and they are not commanded, and it's not a commandment, then someone who's not Jewish can open and close the ark. That's the halakhic argument. But now let's talk about the symbolism of the ark. Every time we open it, we're reenacting Sinai. So then the question becomes, was that moment particular to the Jewish people or universal to the globe? And we have rabbinic literature that reads it both ways. There are those that say that this was all about the Jews receiving Torah and taking on the yoke of heaven and agreeing to keep the mitzvot. And there are others that say all the nations stood and received the wisdom. We have both of those stories in our rabbinic tradition. Rabbi Booth pointed out too that what is the parsha? In which parsha do we receive the Ten Commandments? Yitro. Yitro, the non-Jew, was invaluable to Moshe in helping him be a leader. I think that a non-Jewish person may not choose to ever take on the obligations of Judaism by converting in our community, but I think that they can be like Jethro. They may have a reverence for our holy actions, and they may choose to express support of our Judaism by helping us with our rituals. Then we have to talk about the sociology of the moment. One of the arguments that the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards considered is, look, if we start giving out honors to people who aren't Jewish, perhaps we make it easy for them to not convert. I think that converting happens or doesn't happen for a variety of reasons. I think people choose Judaism because it's the right spiritual path for themselves. I think people choose Judaism because their family of origin can tolerate that choice. It won't cause undue harm to a parent who may be of a different faith. I think people choose Judaism because they feel welcomed by and part of the Jewish community. And I consider the non-Jewish people in our community to be members because they contribute to our welfare. They pay their dues, they bring their children to the learning center, they are sometimes the primary spouse that takes that child to services as they prepare for that bar and bat mitzvah, and they volunteer. They're part of our community whether they eventually choose to become Jewish or not. So I'm focused on honoring them and welcoming them for being present with us. Also, I'm not making this decision out of a sense of fear or scarcity. If we don't become more tolerant, hello Jack, hello Susan. If we don't become more tolerant of the non-Jews in our community, maybe they'll all leave for the reform movement. That's not what I'm worried about. I want to become more inclusive of our non-Jewish members because they contribute a lot to our community, and I'd like to recognize those contributions and celebrate Shabbat with them. Finally, I will say that just like Zacharias Frankel, I do have boundaries. And outside of the halakha, I will not operate. So it is only because there is a halachic decision that allows us to do this that I will. For example, I would not let a non-Jew put on a talit. Why? Because when you put on a talis, you say, Asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav vitzivanu. God commanded me to do this. And you know what? Until you choose Judaism, you're not commanded. Look, all things that are new are uncomfortable at first, including replacing the sacrifices with a system of prayer because the temple no longer stood and rabbinic Judaism was growing. Or driving to synagogue because Jews no longer lived in walking distances of their spiritual homes. Or seeing women lead congregations because now we view both sexes as capable of doing that. And now we live in a world where non-Jews are active members of Jewish communities, and I'd like to create an environment that welcomes them. Now for the more controversial topic of coffee. There are two things I needed to consider in making this decision. The first is the halacha that's on the books. If you open up the tshuva online, the way we are making coffee is not permissible. However, as I took a survey of other conservative communities, many of them make it exactly the way we make it here at Beth Torah. Our current practice is that Maria makes a cup of coffee, or the urn of coffee. She then drinks a cup herself, and then the rest of us are permitted to drink it. So that stems from a halachic principle, which is if a non-Jewish person is cooking food for other non-Jewish people, and a Jew happens to be present, they may partake of that food on Shabbat. An example would be a cruise ship with a buffet line. The non-Jewish cooks are making food for the passengers who are mostly not Jewish, so if you happen to be on that cruise ship on the Sabbath, you too may eat. I think it's a bit of a stretch to the argument that Maria is making 50 cups of coffee for herself, right? But it is grounded in a halachic principle. It's trying to meet the halakha. Another common practice in conservative communities is to use a timer so that the coffee maker will start on its own on the Sabbath. The halachic challenge with that is that cooking on Shabbat means heating up liquid to the point where it's hot enough that if it touched you, your hand would jump, which I would say our coffee is that hot. It doesn't matter that the action started after the Sabbath began or that you preset the motion. It's still cooking the water. Interesting side note, taking a shower is cooking on Shabbat, in case you're wondering, because when you turn on the hot water in the bathroom, what you're doing is asking the hot water tank to fill up with hot water. So you're cooking water on the Sabbath. So it got down to this for me. What was I trying to accomplish by talking to you about coffee? Because really, I'm sure most of you don't care. You just want to drink your cup of coffee, and I get it. What it comes down to is I want people to be more conscious and more thoughtful about the decisions they're making. It's not my job to tell you what the rules are unless they're infringing on communal space. Then I do have to make a decision for all of us. And with the coffee, I feel that there is room to allow for both. Since many conservative communities allow a non-Jewish staff member to make an urn of coffee and they drink it, I would say that is becoming a permissible practice. So we will continue with that. However, every Friday, I will plug in an urn of hot water and I will put instant coffee next to it so that I can enjoy a cup of coffee on the Sabbath. And what I invite each of you to do is to consider, now that you understand the arguments, or if you don't, come and ask me and I'll tell you more about it, to think, what is the right halachic decision for you? What will make your Shabbat and halachic practice meaningful? Shabbat Shalom.